How many people have heard of Jonathan before? You know that name, right? And so I just want to start with this, like a preface. Who's heard of King Saul? And we know that he was the first king of Israel, right? That the prophet Samuel anointed him to be king. Okay, and he had a son. He had several sons, and one son was named Jonathan. Okay, how many people have heard of David? Right. We know also that Samuel anointed David to be king, but this was after Saul was already anointed to be king and became king. And as a matter of fact, David was anointed to be king while Saul was still reigning as king. Everybody know that? Okay. And I just say that because the character study of Jonathan will make more sense if you know how he's related to Saul and to David. And so I almost feel bad for the people back in the sound area because I'm going to be reading so many scriptures tonight. And I just wanted to say that really quickly because the best way, in my opinion, to study the character of Jonathan is to read about him in the Bible and to be focused in on him as the character in these stories versus a lot of times when we read through this, he's not someone that we put a lot of thought into unless you're crazy and weird like me. But he is a great character, and this is a great study of an awesome person. In my opinion, he's a hero. He's the epitome of a hero. So if we start with 1 Samuel chapter 13, and I'd like to read this from the New Living Translation, just because I think we'll get a better sense of who Jonathan is that way through a more modern translation. 1 Samuel chapter 13 says that Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 42 years. Saul selected 3,000 special troops from the army of Israel and sent the rest of the men home. He took 2,000 of those chosen men with him to Michmash in the hill country of Bethel. The other 1,000 went with Saul's son Jonathan to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. So obviously Jonathan is a leader. He's able to lead 1,000 men. Anybody here want to sign up for leading 1,000 guys? Not me either. I can barely lead myself. No, I'm just kidding. And says, soon after this, Jonathan attacked and defeated the garrison of Philistines at Geba. Now, who attacked and defeated that garrison? Can you tell me who defeated and attacked that garrison at Geba? Jonathan. Okay. And then it goes on and says, the news spread quickly among the Philistines. So Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land, saying, Hebrews, hear this, rise up and revolt. Now, why would he do that? Well, because as soon as all the Philistines find out that some of the Israelites destroyed a garrison, it's going to be a lot of unhappy Philistines, right? It's going to be time for war. And so Saul knows, like, oh boy, we better get ready because the Philistines are definitely going to attack us now. Okay, so that's what's happening here. Verse 4, all Israel heard the news that Saul had destroyed the Philistine garrison at Geba. But that's not exactly what happened, is it? I suppose in a way, in a roundabout indirect way, Saul did, but it was only because Jonathan took his 1,000 guys and defeated it. But the news that spread through the land was that Saul defeated it. Saul was the one that had the ram's horn blown and the news spread. Get what I'm saying? Talk about spin doctors in the 20th and 21st century. I think Saul did a little bit of spinning on the news here. It wasn't Saul that defeated that garrison. It was his son Jonathan. It wasn't 2,000 men that defeated it. It was the 1,000 men or less. So here we are. So all Israel heard the news that Saul had destroyed the Philistine garrison at Geba and that the Philistines now hated the Israelites more than ever. So the entire Israelite army was summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Now the Philistines mustered a mighty army of 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and as many warriors as the grains of sand on the seashore. That's a lot of people, isn't it? They camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. Now the men of Israel saw what a tight spot they were in, and because they were hard pressed by the enemy, they tried to hide in caves, thickets, rocks, holes, and cisterns. Interestingly, Saddam Hussein was found in a cistern. They're still doing it in the Middle East, hiding in holes. Verse 7, some of them crossed the Jordan River and escaped into the land of Gad and Gilead. They're like, we're out of here. Meanwhile, Saul stayed at Gilgal, and his men were trembling with fear. And Saul waited there 7 days for Samuel, as Samuel had instructed him earlier, but Samuel still didn't come. Saul realized that his troops were rapidly slipping away, so he demanded, bring me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Saul sacrificed the burnt offering himself. But he's not a prophet or a priest. He's a king. So he's doing something he should not do. Okay, one of the things, when I asked us that by understanding who Saul and David were and their relationship to Jonathan, we understand Jonathan better. But also the way the Bible presents Jonathan and Saul and David, we could understand Jonathan better. We can understand these three characters better by comparing them to one another. Now, ordinarily, I'm not going to compare myself to you, and you shouldn't compare yourself to me. But when we're studying the Bible, these three characters are put in there the way they are for a reason, so that we can understand something. I want you to compare Jonathan with David, and I want you to contrast Jonathan with his father Saul. Get that? Compare Jonathan with David. Compare those two, but contrast Jonathan and Saul. Okay, so verse 10. Just as Saul was finishing with the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. Should have waited, Saul. You should have waited. He was almost there. So Saul went out to meet and welcome him, but Samuel said, what is this you have done? And Saul replied, I saw my men scattering from me, and you didn't arrive when you said you would. Now, wait a second. You ever said something like that to your mom or dad or to your teacher, and they explain to you, like, look, you're the student, I'm the teacher. Okay? Who's the parent here? But here goes Saul saying, you didn't arrive when you said you would, and the Philistines are at Michmash ready for battle. So I said, the Philistines are ready to march against us at Gilgal, and I haven't even asked for the Lord's help. You don't need to burn an offering to do that. You don't need to take someone else's job. You just need to ask. And Saul says, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering myself before you came. And Samuel says in verse 13, how foolish, Samuel exclaimed, you have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. And Samuel then, and guess who that person was? That was David. Seeking out David. God sought a man after his own heart. Can't stop there. Verse 15. Samuel then left Gilgal and went on his way, but the rest of the troops went with Saul to meet the army. And they went up from Gilgal to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. When Saul counted the men who were still with him, he found only 600 were left out of 2,000. Saul and Jonathan and the troops with them were staying at Geba in the land of Benjamin. The Philistines set up their camp at Michmash. 3 raiding parties soon left the camp of the Philistines. One went north toward Ophrah in the land of Shual. Another went west to Beth Horon. And the third moved toward the border above the valley of Zeboim near the wilderness. Everybody said, sounds like they were surrounded. Yep. Verse 19 says, there were no blacksmiths in the land of Israel in those days. And this is why the Philistines wouldn't allow them, for fear they would make swords and spears for the Hebrews. So whenever the Israelites needed to sharpen their plowshares, picks, axes, or sickles, they had to take them to a Philistine blacksmith. You thought that stuff just happened in trade wars today, didn't you? It's been going on for a long time. And it even says in verse 21, the charges were as follows: 1/4 of an ounce of silver for sharpening a plowshare or a pick, and 1/8 of an ounce for sharpening an axe or making the point of an ox goad. So on the day of the battle, none of the people of Israel had a sword or spear except for Saul and Jonathan. Oh, not exactly prepared, were they? They did have those sharp farming and work implements, axes and ox goads and things, but they didn't have swords or spears or bows and arrows. They were in sad shape. So verse 23, the pass at Michmash had meanwhile been secured by a contingent of the Philistine army. So now they're trapped. Well, one day Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost. But Jonathan did not tell his father what he was doing. Meanwhile, Saul and his 600 men were camped on the outskirts of Gibeah around the pomegranate tree at Migron. Among Saul's men was Ahijah the priest, who was wearing the ephod, the priestly vest. Ahijah was the son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord who had served at Shiloh. Well, no one realized that Jonathan had left the Israelite camp. And to reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to go down between two rocky cliffs that were called Bozez and Sina. And the cliff on the north was in front of Michmash, and the one on the south was in front of Geba. Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans, Jonathan said to his armor bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. So, first of all, the way to get there wasn't even easy. And then when they got there, he's like, okay, you don't have to do this if you don't want to. But if you want to, let's go. Because it doesn't take very many for God to win a battle. And so the armor bearer replies in verse 7, do what you think is best. The armor bearer replied, I'm with you completely, whatever you decide. I like that guy too. All right then, Jonathan told them, we will cross over and let them see us. If they say to us, stay where you are or we'll kill you, then we will stop and not go up to them. But if they say, come on up and fight, then we will go up. That will be the Lord's sign that he will help us defeat them. Okay. That's optimism and faith. Yeah. Verse 11, when the Philistines saw them coming, they shouted, look, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes. Then the men from the outpost shouted to Jonathan, come on up here and we'll teach you a lesson. Sounds like pretty sorry last words to me. Anyway, and Jonathan goes, come on, climb right behind me, Jonathan said to his armor bearer, for the Lord will help us defeat them. He got to be a true believer to believe that the two of them is going to defeat the whole Philistine army. But he understood it would be God. Verse 13, so they climbed up using both hands. And now I don't know about you, but I'm not going to be climbing up anywhere where I got to use both my hands and my feet to the top where someone's standing with swords and spears and things like that. That doesn't make sense to me. But that's what they did. So they climbed up using both hands and feet, and the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed those who came behind them. They killed some 20 men in all, and their bodies were scattered over about a half an acre. Verse 15, suddenly panic broke out in the Philistine army, both in the camp and in the field, including even the outposts and raiding parties, and just then an earthquake struck and everyone was terrified. Yeah, God will work with you, signs following. That's what he said in the New Testament, and that's what he's doing here. Verse 16 says, Saul's lookouts in Gibeah of Benjamin saw a strange sight. The vast army of Philistines began to melt away in every direction. He had no idea it was Jonathan and Jonathan's armor bearer. Verse 17 says, call the roll and find out who's missing, Saul ordered. And when they checked, they found that Jonathan and his armor bearer were gone. And then Saul shouted to Ahijah, bring the ephod here. For at that time Ahijah was wearing the ephod in front of the Israelites. But while Saul was talking to the priest, the confusion in the Philistine camp grew louder and louder. So Saul said to the priest, never mind, let's get going. Saul, what's wrong with you? Verse 20, then Saul and all his men rushed out to the battle and found the Philistines killing each other. They were in dazed confusion and terror. And so there was terrible confusion everywhere. Even the Hebrews who had previously gone over to the Philistine army, they were so scared that they thought, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And now they're switching sides again. Probably not someone you want to depend, stake your life on, but anyway. Even the Hebrews who had previously gone over to the Philistine army revolted and joined in with Saul, Jonathan, and the rest of the Israelites. Likewise, the men of Israel who were hiding in the hill country of Ephraim joined the chase when they saw the Philistines running away. Kind of like a cat that hides under something till you walk by, right? And then they come running out. Verse 23, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle continued to rage even beyond Beth-Aven. Now, in verse 24, now the men of Israel were pressed to exhaustion that day because Saul had placed them under an oath, saying, let a curse fall on anyone who eats before evening, before I have full revenge on my enemies. What in the world? So no one ate anything all day, even though they had all found honeycomb on the ground in the forest. They didn't dare touch the honey because they all feared the oath they had taken. Verse 27, but Jonathan had not heard his father's command, and he dipped the end of his stick into a piece of honeycomb and ate the honey. After he had eaten it, he felt refreshed. But one of the men saw him and said, your father made the army take a strict oath that anyone who eats food today will be cursed. That is why everyone is weary and faint. Verse 29, my father has made trouble for us all, Jonathan exclaimed. A command like that only hurts us. See how refreshed I am now that I've eaten this little bit of honey? If the men had been allowed to eat freely from the food they found among our enemies, think how many more Philistines we could have killed. Verse 31, they chased and killed the Philistines all day from Michmash to Ajalon, growing more and more faint. And that evening they rushed for the battle plunder and butchered the sheep, goats, cattle, and calves, but they ate them without draining the blood. Someone reported to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that still has blood in it. In other words, they didn't cook it. They were so famished and hungry, they just slaughtered it and started eating it. That is very wrong, Saul said. Find a large stone and roll it over here. And then go out among the troops and tell them, bring the cattle, sheep, and goats here to me, kill them here and drain the blood before you eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with the blood still in it. So that night, all the troops brought their animals and slaughtered them there. And then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first of the altars he built to the Lord. Then Saul said, let's chase the Philistines all night and plunder them until sunrise. Let's destroy every last one of them. His men replied, we'll do whatever you think is best. But the priests said, let's ask God first. So Saul asked God, should we go after the Philistines? Will you help us defeat them? But God made no reply that day. God was not pleased with Saul anymore. Verse 38, then Saul said to the leaders, something's wrong. I want all my army commanders to come here. We must find out what sin was committed today. I vow by the name of the Lord who rescued Israel that the sinner will surely die, even if it is my own son Jonathan." But no one would tell him what the trouble was. And then Saul said, "Jonathan and I will stand over here, and all of you stand over there." And the people responded to Saul, "Whatever you think is best." And then Saul prayed, "O Lord God of Israel, please show us who is guilty and who is innocent." And then they cast sacred lots, and Jonathan and Saul were chosen as the guilty ones, and the people were declared innocent. And then Saul said, "Well, now cast lots again and choose between me and Jonathan." And Jonathan was shown to be the guilty one. He said, "Tell me what you have done," Saul demanded of Jonathan. "I tasted a little honey," Jonathan admitted. "It was only a little bit on the end of my stick. Does that deserve death?" "Yes, Jonathan," Saul said, "you must die. May God strike me and even kill me if you do not die for this." "Saul, have you lost your mind?" Verse 45, "But the people broke in and said to Saul, 'Jonathan has won this great victory for Israel. Should he die? Far from it. As surely as the Lord lives, not one hair on his head will be touched, for God helped him do a great deed today.'" Those were the men that actually fought in the battle and knew that it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who'd climbed that rock and started a rout that day. Saul didn't have time to put a spin on this one. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death that day. And then Saul called back the army from chasing the Philistines, and the Philistines returned home. All right, let's move on to chapter 18. And so what happens after that then is where David becomes anointed by Samuel the prophet and goes back to keeping the sheep. David's brothers were fighting with Saul, and the giant Goliath comes out and starts defying the armies of Israel. They're set up again, and Jonathan's kind of absent for about 4 chapters here. And I don't know where he was or what he was doing or etc. It's not really very much on the scene. And so then, David kills the giant and all that. And so here we are at chapter 18. David's killed the giant. He's come in to talk to Saul. Saul called for him, like, "Who are you?" "Well, I'm just the guy that's been playing your harp for the last however many months, and you don't know my name yet." Anyway, that's interesting. You go back and study that. And so here we are at chapter 18, verse 1. After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son, and there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. Now, why do you think that is? If Jonathan saw Saul go out and fight Goliath, Jonathan's the guy that said to his armor bearer, "Let's climb up this cliff and attack the Philistines, because God can, it's not few or many, God can save with whoever." And David virtually did the same thing, going out in front of the giant, this little guy with the shepherd's bag and 5 stones in a sling against a guy that's like 9.5 feet tall and built like a lineman in the NFL, huge, and wins that battle. So, of course, there's an immediate bond between them. But verse 2 says, "From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home." Because he loved David so much, partly, but also so they could keep track of him. Verse 3, "And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself." Verse 4, "Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt." Those were all royal belongings. Yeah. And so you can also see that Jonathan's the type of guy that would give you the shirt off his back. That's literally what he did. The robe, the tunic underneath the robe, the sword, the bow, and the belt that holds the sword on and holds it all together. Verse 5, "Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. And when the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals, and this was their song: Saul has killed his 1,000, and David is 10,000s. Let's see how well that went over with Saul. Verse 8, this made Saul very angry. What's this, he said. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. He didn't like it. He knew what Samuel had said. Verse 10, the very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. And David was playing the harp as he did each day, but Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. Saul was then afraid of David, for the Lord was with David and had turned away from Saul. Finally, Saul sent him away and appointed him commander over 1,000 men, and David faithfully led his troops into battle. Jonathan had 1,000 men. David had 1,000 men. Verse 14, David continued to succeed in everything he did, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was so successful at leading his troops into battle. One day Saul said to David, I am ready to give you my older daughter Merab as your wife, but first you must prove yourself to be a real warrior by fighting the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, I'll send him out against the Philistines and let them kill him rather than doing it myself. Who am I and what is my family in Israel that I should be the king's son-in-law? David exclaimed. And so when the time came for Saul to give his daughter Merab in marriage to David, he gave her instead to Adriel, a man from Meholah. Saul, a true man of his word, not. In the meantime, and so Saul had another daughter, and she loved David, and so David did what he had to do again to fight the Philistines, and came back after doing that. And finally Saul just relented and gave the younger daughter to David as his wife. But verse 29 says, Saul became even more afraid of him, and he remained David's enemy for the rest of his life. Verse 30 says, every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than all the rest of Saul's officers, so David's name became very famous. Let's go to 19. Saul now urged his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. But Jonathan, because of his strong affection for David, told him what his father was planning. So instead of obeying his father, he told David what Saul was planning. They had a pact. He said, tomorrow morning, he warned him, you must find a hiding place out in the fields. I'll ask my father to go out there with me, and I'll talk to him about you, and then I'll tell you everything I can find out. So he acts as David's spy. Verse 4, the next morning, Jonathan spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. The king must not sin against his servant David, Jonathan said. He's never done anything to harm you. He has always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten about the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant and how the Lord brought a great victory to all Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There is no reason for it at all. So Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. I don't know if he actually meant that vow, but he did make that vow. Verse 7, afterward Jonathan called David and told him what had happened, and then he brought David to Saul, and David served in the court as before. So Jonathan's also willing to play the diplomat, to reconcile people. Verse 8, war broke out again after that, and David led his troops against the Philistines. He attacked them with such fury that they all ran away. But one day when Saul was sitting at home with a spear in the hand, I don't know, I guess Saul just sits around with a spear in his hand all the time. A little bit odd. But anyway, the tormenting spirit from the Lord suddenly came upon him again. As David played his harp, Saul hurled the spear at David, but David dodged out of the way, and leaving the spear stuck in the wall, he fled and escaped into the night. Then Saul sent troops to watch David's house, and they were told to kill David when he came out the next morning. And so is David's wife put a little idol in the bed, and David escaped during the night. And so verse 14, when the troops came to arrest David, she told him he was sick, he couldn't get out of bed, and he sent them away. Saul sent the troops back to get David, and he ordered, as I'm in verse 15, he ordered, bring him to me in his bed so I can kill him. But when they came to carry David out, they discovered that it was only an idol in the bed with a cushion of goat's hair at his head. And of course, then Saul's upset with his daughter. Verse 17, why have you betrayed me like this and let my enemy escape? Saul demanded of Michal. And then Michal lies. I guess she's her father's daughter. I had to, Michal replied. He threatened to kill me if I didn't help him. That's not true. That's a lie. But Saul told the first lies, right? So, and lies do have their effect. And now the word is getting out that David is a rebel and an outlaw and a wife beater. You know what I'm saying? Those things are getting out. So 18, so David escaped and went to Ramah to see Samuel, and he told him all that Saul had done to him. Then Samuel took David with him to live at Naioth. I don't know how to say it. That's close enough, I guess. When the report reached Saul that David was at Naioth in Ramah, he sent troops to capture him. But when they arrived and saw Samuel leading a group of prophets who were prophesying, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also began prophesying. And goes on and on that way until Saul comes to the place and he ends up on the ground prophesying too. The Spirit of God overpowered them all. And so then we get to chapter 20. So David now fled from Naioth and Ramah, while the Spirit of God had overpowered Saul. David flees the Pentecostal church service, right? David now fled from Naioth and Ramah and found Jonathan. It says, he went to Jonathan and says, what have I done? He exclaimed, what is my crime? How have I offended your father that he is so determined to kill me? Verse 2, that's not true, Jonathan protested. You're not going to die. He always tells me everything he's going to do, even the little things. I know my father wouldn't hide something like this from me. It just isn't so. In verse 3, then David took an oath before Jonathan and said, your father knows perfectly well about our friendship, so he has said to himself, I won't tell Jonathan. Why should I hurt him? But I swear to you that I am only a step away from death. I swear it by the Lord and by your own soul. Verse 4, tell me what I can do to help you, Jonathan exclaimed. Verse 5, David replied, tomorrow we celebrate the new moon festival. I've always eaten with the king on this occasion, but tomorrow I'll hide in the field and stay there until the evening of the third day. If your father asks where I am, tell him I asked permission to go home to Bethlehem for an annual family sacrifice. If he says, fine, you will know all is well. But if he's angry and loses his temper, you will know he's determined to kill me. Show me this loyalty as my sworn friend, for we made a solemn pact before the Lord. Or kill me yourself if I have sinned against your father. But please don't betray me to him. And Jonathan, verse 9, never, Jonathan exclaimed. You know that if I had the slightest notion my father was planning to kill you, I would tell you at once. Then David asked, how will I know whether or not your father is angry? Verse 11, come out to the field with me, Jonathan replied, and they went out there together. And then Jonathan told David, I promise by the Lord, the God of Israel, that by this time tomorrow or the next day at the latest, I will talk to my father and let you know at once how he feels about you. If he speaks favorably about you, I will let you know. But if he is angry and wants you killed, may the Lord strike me and even kill me if I don't warn you so you can escape and live. May the Lord be with you as he used to be with my father. And may you treat me with the faithful love of the Lord as long as I live. But if I die, treat my family with this faithful love, even when the Lord destroys all your enemies from the face of the earth. And what is he saying there? So everybody thinks it'd be great to be royalty. But I got to tell you, the last royal family in Russia, they executed all of them. I think there's a few that have escaped Russia who are distantly related, but they still live in lay low, quiet. Don't say anything about going back to Russia. Yeah. And so typically what happened is when a new dynasty takes over in a kingdom, they kill everybody in the family of the old dynasty. All of them. And sometimes their servants too. Wipe out the competition. So what Jonathan is saying here is when you become king, please don't kill all my offspring. Please don't allow them to be wiped out. Verse 16, so Jonathan made a solemn pact with David, saying, may the Lord destroy all your enemies. And Jonathan made David reaffirm his vow of friendship again, for Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. Isn't that the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself? Yeah. Verse 18, then Jonathan said, tomorrow we celebrate the new moon festival. You will be missed when your place at the table is empty. And the day after tomorrow, toward evening, go to the place where you hid before and wait there by the stone pile. I will come out and shoot 3 arrows to the side of the stone pile as though I were shooting at a target. And then I'll send a boy to bring the arrows back. If you hear me tell him they're on this side, then you will know as surely as the Lord lives that all is well and there's no trouble. But if I tell him, go farther, the arrows are still ahead of you, then it will mean that you must leave immediately, for the Lord is sending you away. And may the Lord make us keep our promises to each other, for he has witnessed them. This guy's a believer, isn't he? Verse 24, so David hid himself in the field, and when the new moon festival began, the king sat down to eat. And he sat at his usual place against the wall, with Jonathan sitting opposite him and Abner beside him. But David's place was empty. Saul didn't say anything about it that day, for he said to himself, something must have made David ceremonially unclean. But when David's place was empty again the next day, Saul asked Jonathan, why hasn't the son of Jesse been here for the meal either yesterday or today? Well, Jonathan replied, David earnestly asked me if he could go to Bethlehem. He said, please let me go, for we are having a family sacrifice. My brother demanded that I be there, so please let me get away to see my brothers. That's why he isn't here at the king's table. Verse 30, Saul boiled with rage at Jonathan. And this is the closest the Bible gets to swearing. And I'm not going to read it. But Jonathan pretty much swore at him. Saul pretty much swore at Jonathan, not saying nice things. So do you think I don't know that you want him to be king in your place, shaming yourself and your mother? As long as that son of Jesse is alive, you'll never be king. Now go and get him so I can kill him. He is dead set against God's plan at this point, isn't he? But Jonathan's not. Don't we sometimes go through struggles like this, New Testament believers? Sometimes in families or relationships, or it can be set against each other. It's hard. You still got to follow Jesus. Verse 32. But why should he be put to death? Jonathan asked his father. What has he done? Then Saul hurled a spear at Jonathan, intending to kill him. Finally, at this point, he's like, I got other sons. So at last, Jonathan realized that his father was really determined to kill David. Jonathan didn't want to believe it. Okay, we do that. We don't want to believe it until it's spelled out to us in absolute black and white. You know, when your dad's hurling a spear at you to sticking in the wall, you begin to understand he's lost his mind and he's serious. He means it. Verse 34, Jonathan left the table in fierce anger and refused to eat on that second day of the festival, for he was crushed by his father's shameful behavior toward David. He was ashamed of him. Verse 35, the next morning, as agreed, Jonathan went out into the field and took a young boy with him to gather his arrows. Start running, he told the boy, so you can find the arrows as I shoot them. So the boy ran, and Jonathan shot an arrow beyond him. And when the boy had almost reached the arrow, Jonathan shouted, the arrow is still ahead of you. Hurry, hurry, don't wait. So the boy quickly gathered up the arrows and ran back to his master. He, of course, suspected nothing. Only Jonathan and David understood the signal. And then Jonathan gave his bow and arrows to the boy and told him to take them back to town. And that should have probably been the end of it, but these two were too good of friends to just part ways. And so verse 41, as soon as the boy was gone, David came out from where he'd been hiding near the stone pile. Then David bowed 3 times to Jonathan with his face to the ground. Wow. And David bowed to Jonathan. Both of them were in tears as they embraced each other and said goodbye, especially David. They figured at this point they're headed different directions. At last, Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for we have sworn loyalty to each other in the Lord's name. The Lord is the witness of a bond between us and our children forever. And then David left, and Jonathan returned to the town. Let's go on to chapter 23. So, one day news came to David that at this point, David's basically considered an outlaw, leader of an outlaw band of 400 men in Israel. And one day news came to David that the Philistines were at Keilah stealing grain from the threshing floors. And David asked the Lord, should I go and attack them? And God answered David. He said, yes, go and save Keilah, the Lord told him. But David's men said, we're afraid even here in Judah. We certainly don't want to go to Keilah to fight the whole Philistine army. So David asked the Lord again, and again the Lord replied, go down to Keilah, for I will help you conquer the Philistines. So David and his men went to Keilah, and they slaughtered the Philistines and took all their livestock and rescued the people of Keilah. Now, when Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, he brought the ephod with him. So there's a priest with David also now. Mainly because Saul had killed all of the priests, because he thought that they had helped David escape, when the truth is the priests knew nothing about David escaping. So Saul had Doeg, an Edomite, who was the keeper of the king's herds, kill 70-some priests, and only this one man escaped to David. What is wrong with you, Saul? Have you lost your mind? Saul soon learned that David was at Keilah. Good, he exclaimed. We've got him now. God has handed him over to me, for he has trapped himself in a walled town. So Saul mobilized his entire army to march to Keilah and besiege David and his men. But David learned of Saul's plan and told Abiathar the priest to bring the ephod and asked the Lord what he should do. And then David prayed, O Lord God of Israel, I have heard that Saul is planning to come and destroy Keilah because I'm here. Will the leaders of Keilah betray me to him? And will Saul actually come as I have heard? O Lord God of Israel, please tell me. And the Lord said, he will come. Again, David asked, will the leaders of Keilah betray me and my men to Saul? And the Lord replied, yes, they will betray you. So David and his men, about 600 of them, now left Keilah and began roaming the countryside, and word soon reached Saul that David had escaped, so he didn't go to Keilah after all. And David now stayed in the strongholds of the wilderness and in the hill country of Ziph. Saul hunted him day after day, but God didn't let Saul find him. One day near Horesh, David received the news that Saul was on the way to Ziph to search for him and kill him. Verse 16, Jonathan went to find David and encouraged him to stay strong in his faith in God. Verse 17, "Don't be afraid," Jonathan reassured him. "My father will never find you. You are going to be the king of Israel, and I will be next to you, as my father Saul is well aware." And he was okay with it. Jonathan was okay with it. Second's great. I don't need to be king. We just need the Lord to win the victories. We just need for God to get all the praise. So the two of them renewed their solemn pact before the Lord, and then Jonathan returned home while David stayed at Horesh. And then it relates an incident where Saul is pursuing David and he's closing in on him, but Saul goes into a cave, and David's actually able to go in and cut off a piece of Saul's robe. And Saul leaves the cave, and David says, I could have killed you today, but I'm not going to stretch forth my hand against the Lord's anointed. Why do you keep pursuing me? I'm just a flea. I'm a dead dog. And Saul says, God bless you for what you've done today. And at one point, Saul says, I know that you're going to do great things and succeed. But then the next day, Saul's back to trying to kill him. Not following God. Let's go to chapter 31. And I'm getting close to finished. And everybody said, praise the Lord. Because you've done way too much reading tonight, Brother Kevin. So, in chapter 31, Saul and Jonathan and the army of the Israelites are fighting the Philistines. And I'm just going to paraphrase it because it's 7:35, right? And Saul and Jonathan are both killed by the Philistines. And the whole Israel's overrun. And now David and his men weren't a part of this. They were actually off by Ziklag, somewhere in the south of Judah. And I don't have time to get into all the reasons why of all that, but they're not involved in this battle. And so Saul and Jonathan are killed. Actually, Saul probably committed suicide. Jonathan was killed. Saul fell on his sword because he was afraid that the Philistines were going to come and torture him and abuse him before they killed him. But Jonathan died in battle. And then in 2 Samuel chapter 1, there's an Amalekite person, which I don't have time to get into all the symbolism of that either, but he came to David with the news that I won't get that gruesome, but he came with evidence that Saul and Jonathan had been killed. And he told, David said, well, how was it that it happened? He said, well, I saw Saul and I knew that he couldn't live, so I killed him. And David said, oh, so you killed, how was it that you weren't afraid to stretch forth your hand against the Lord's anointed? He had been an anointed king, God, anointed by the prophet Samuel. And so he just told the guy, said, your mouth has testified against you. And so they executed that man. He thought he was going to get a reward for telling David that. When David said, no, you don't stretch forth your hand against the Lord's anointed. Now, why would David say that? Well, because David was the Lord's anointed. It's a good precedent. We're going to follow the rule of law here. And so then he realizes that his best friend, Jonathan, had been killed. And he goes into a long lament. Just a song and poetry is like you can tell it's just unbelievable. It's just tearing David up inside because Jonathan was such an awesome guy. Like he'd have done anything for David. He'd do anything for the Lord. He didn't care about being the king. He didn't. And he died in battle. So then we get to 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4. Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth was 5 when Jonathan died. And Mephibosheth's nurse picked him up to run. They were running for their lives because the Philistines were going to come and take the cities. And so the nurse fell, and Mephibosheth fell, and he became lame in his feet. Then we get on to chapter 9, and David's established as king, and he says, is there anybody left of the house of Saul that I might show kindness to? And he comes across Jonathan's servant, and I can't remember the servant's name right now, but he said, yeah, there's Mephibosheth. And so he commanded the Mephibosheth's servant to take care of all the lands of Jonathan, but Mephibosheth's going to eat at the king's table with the king's sons, basically adopted. So that those families together. I know we read a lot, but when you look at the character of Jonathan, when you read through those chapters, and we don't usually focus on him, when you think of who Jonathan was, words like faithful, trustworthy, humble, powerful, awesome, I don't know, cool. Like, this guy's really cool. I don't know. That's why I didn't do the board with the words, because I just got to a point I was like, this guy's really a hero. And a couple days ago was Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday on the calendar. And one of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. said in one of his speeches, I think it was at the end of one of his speeches, is that the time is always right to do what is right. And that's exactly the way Jonathan lived. Time's always right to do what is right, whether it's popular, whether it's hard, whether it's unpopular, whether it's easy. Always do the right thing. No matter what it costs you and no matter where it leads you, always do the right thing. It's always the right time to do the right thing. Let's all stand together. Thank you for putting up with me being long-winded about one of my favorite characters in the Bible, because I could go on another hour, I'm telling you. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your precious word. We thank you for the character Jonathan in the Bible. We thank you for all the things that he exemplifies to us. Help us to love our neighbor just like Jonathan loved his, and to continue putting our faith and trust in you and believe in you for great things. You're a miracle-working God. We look forward to what you have in store for this church and for each of us. In Jesus' name, amen.